Welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 150. And this time I'm going to talk about Led Zeppelin's sophomore effort, appropriately enough entitled Led Zeppelin 2. And what I have here is one of those remasters which Jimmy did in the mid-20-teens. I think this is from 2014. Lots of opinions available online about those reissues, but I would agree with the general consensus that on this one at least, Jimmy did a really good job. This was an extraordinarily talented group of musicians who never stayed in one place for very long. Their first album had been recorded after they'd only been together about a month, and they had basically made the best of what they had available at the time, which was some songs Jimmy had written, a few pieces they'd worked out together in the studio, some blues covers, some folk covers, a fair amount of borrowing, and so on. And I'm not going to get heavily into the Led Zeppelin borrowing discussion here. I actually address that at some length in my review of Led Zeppelin 1, and please feel free to have a look at that. This record, although very much the same formula as the first record, does break some new ground. Robert Plant has tamed his voice a little bit, and he's a touch more selective about the use of his higher range. This record, too, although the first record was quite heavy, plumbs even greater depths. This was, at the time of its release, probably the heaviest album ever recorded, at least until Black Sabbath's debut came out a few months later. There's an incredible bottom end to this record, which accounts for why it's always been mastered at a slightly lower level than a typical album. The overall production, like pretty much everything Jimmy was doing in this era, is excellent. It's an uneven record, but it contains some of the greatest music they ever recorded and probably some of the greatest rock and roll ever recorded. It put them squarely on top of the rock and roll pile, where they stayed, I think unarguably, until mid-1975, but some would say they stayed there until it all came to an end in September 1980. 1969 was the year it all happened for Led Zeppelin. In December 1968, they were relative unknowns outside of Jimmy Page's history with the Yardbirds. They were touring the States, playing university gyms in Spokane, misbilled as Len Zeppelin. But by the end of '69, they had two huge albums out. They'd conquered the United States, and they were back in England preparing to play to a packed house at the Royal Albert Hall. Jimmy had been left holding the rights to the Yardbirds name and wanted to form a new band with Peter Grant as manager. He had a really clear idea of what he wanted to do as well. He wanted a band which was heavier than anything which had come before, but mixed with lots of lighter elements. While covers were necessary in the early days, the idea was to write originals ultimately, and to create a whole new sound based on the skills which Jimmy had acquired in the studio over about a decade as a session musician. He'd already worked in the studio with multi-instrumentalist John Paul Jones, who had asked if he could be part of any band that Jimmy would ultimately put together after the Yardbirds. Page scouted an unknown singer out of Birmingham called Robert Plant, who in turn recommended his former bandmate on drums, John Bonham. The four of them came together in August 1968, and the chemistry was instant. Zeppelin toured relentlessly almost from the get-go in 1968, and by the time the first album came out in January '69, they'd already toured the UK, Scandinavia, and the United States. This album was finished at the end of the summer of 1969, and in the first 8 months of that year, they gigged something like 140 different times, and that includes 3 tours of North America and 2 tours of Europe. The band was also evolving rapidly, and this is quite easy to hear if you listen to any of the countless bootlegs which are all over the internet, particularly all over YouTube. They're basically developing new elements of songs every single night, using extended jams to work out different kinds of ideas. This commitment to improvising, which came from the trust that the four bandmates had in each other and the sheer quality of their playing, led them to become a whole different thing live to many other bands, as most hardcore fans can tell you. And if you really want to go down that rabbit hole, there's no site that I'd recommend more than The Year of Led Zeppelin, which was put together by a guy called Ronnie Fritz, who in less than 12 months listened to all 274 extant recordings of Zeppelin in concert. Because of all this touring, this album is written and recorded on tour, largely in North America, but also at points in the UK. The recording dates stretch from January to August 1969. As I mentioned, Jimmy is the producer, and he has help from 2 engineers along the way, George Kayantz and Eddie Kramer, with whom Zeppelin would have a long professional relationship. There are different sessions for each song, and the band ends up using no fewer than 13 different studios. Consistency in the quality of the sound of this record is pretty amazing when you consider how many different studio setups they actually had to learn. Some of the studios were well established, like Sunset Sound in LA. Others, like the long-gone R&D studios, which used to be at 452 West Broadway in Vancouver, were pretty rudimentary. Apparently this studio, which was where Robert recorded the harmonica part for Bring It On Home, had an 8-track recording setup in kind of a Quonset hut, but no headphone jacks. For reasons of time, which I guess are obvious given all this history, most of the songs in here were actually simply recorded live in the studio. Some overdubs and mixing were done on tour, but the final mix by Page and Kramer was done at A&R Studios in New York in about the 3rd week of July, over a weekend. After a number of delays, it's finally released in October 1969, and it is a massive hit. Within 6 months, it sells 3 million copies. It knocks Abbey Road off the top of the album charts, and the lead-off track, Whole Lotta Love, goes to number 4, which was their only top 10 hit, surprisingly enough, in the United States. Side 1 starts with a wheeze, that riff that you could invade whole countries with, Jimmy's incredibly heavy guitar tone. This, of course, is a Whole Lot of Love, eventually to be credited to Willie Dixon as well as the band members because, of course, Robert had pinched his lyrics. This is a song with an almost illegal number of hooks, but strangely enough, other than the freakout section, it's actually quite a simple song. It's just that same excellent riff, pounded again and again and again. And that, of course, is probably why it's so satisfying. And that, of course, is the philosophy around which bands like Black Sabbath build a whole career. There's so much else about the production as well. The drum sound is fat and crisp at the same time. Dynamics are incredible. The freakout section includes all kinds of techniques. They used a theremin, they used napalm explosions, they took Jimmy's slide guitar and they played it backwards. This is bluntly a pretty sexual song, and the 6 bars of that guitar solo are just electric. Even the mistakes work out here. This song basically has everything going for it. That vocal that you can hear of Robert's during the freakout section was actually a guide vocal, which they couldn't get off the tape, and then decided to soak it in reverb and keep it in, and it now seems as if it was intentional. What Is and What Should Never Be is one of the many places where the production brings John Paul Jones's bass right to the fore. Lots of other interesting choices here, like the really dirty tone of the rhythm guitar during the choruses, contrasted with the solo tone, which is so sweet. But what I think I love most about this song is Jimmy's timing in the outro. When he's coming back in after each rhythm figure, there's just a little bit of delay. It's perfection. The Lemon song started life in Zeppelin's repertoire under its original title, Killing Floor, and of course, it's a Howling Wolf song. Early live versions of the song, which was a key part of their set in the spring of '69, have an absolutely killer, gritty guitar tone, particularly the gigs at the Fillmore in San Francisco. The recorded version has another excellent John Paul Jones bass line, high in the mix, so good. The drums are mic'd perfectly. Stellar dynamics from Robert, who puts in a really great performance, lemon squeezing notwithstanding. I think my favorite part of this song, and possibly my favorite part of this whole record, is actually the 12 bars after the lemon squeezing, where John Paul Jones and Bonham are totally in the pocket and Jimmy is soloing over top. The fast bits of the song are okay, but the slow parts are butter. Side 1 closes out with Thank You, which is one of the most beautiful songs they've ever recorded. This is Robert's first writing credit with the band. It was written for his wife, and it's kind of hard after a year of groupies to see this as anything other than scratching his guilty conscience. Some of the less remarked aspects of this song are Bonzo's drumming, which I think is epic, and also possibly Jimmy's most beautiful solo, often overlooked, I think, because it's a little bit buried in the mix and it's on acoustic, so maybe it doesn't stand out. Side 2, of course, starts with Heartbreaker, one of the great balls-out Guitar Hero rock songs, stripping rock and roll right down to its essence. And the tone is also incredible, having something, I think, to do with the fact that this is the first song on which Jimmy introduces his what would become legendary combination of a Les Paul run through Marshall Stacks. The song's simple and catchy, but it also has a great sense of theater, which begins right at the beginning of the song, when just leading into the opening riff, Jimmy bends a G up to an A, and just the time he takes to do that builds the anticipation until you get bludgeoned by that riff. The solo famously has mistakes. Having listened to a lot of bootlegs, I can say he never played it the same way twice, and he never played it without mistakes. Commonly, and you could listen to How the West Was Won or some of the early LA bootlegs, you could hear him play Bach's Bourrée in E minor during the solo, but that doesn't appear on here. Next song, Livin' Lovin' Maid, probably has a claim to be their most misogynistic song, and interestingly enough, the band pretty much universally hated this song as soon as they recorded it, and they never played it live, which is pretty unusual. Setting all that aside, musically it's actually pretty catchy, so I guess we can basically file it along with Rush's Fly By Night as tunes which bands basically consider their own pet peeves. The third song on side 2 is Ramble On, which I think is indisputably a piece of genius, whether or not you like the Tolkien references. It's got multiple riffs, it's got multiple hooks, it's got an epic bass part. What else to say about this? Well, the Lord of the Rings lore, which Robert mentions, is a little bit off, but I guess if Peter Jackson can get away with it, so can Robert. It also has this incredibly extended fade out, which lasts about 45 seconds. And I don't know if you're like this, but for me as a kid, found me constantly cranking my volume on my stereo just to be able to hear the last few notes. Now we arrive at Moby Dick. What's to say other than it's mercifully short compared to the 20-minute plus versions you get if you went to a concert around this time. The final song, Bring It On Home, is to me the real low point of the album, and I will confess I have never been a fan of this track from day one. This song really is everything that Zeppelin's critics accused them of. It's an amped up blues cover that just doesn't work. It's got a plodding beat, it's got a really shrill sounding, kind of harsh riff, but more importantly, there's really no two ways to say it. Robert's mimicry of a black American accent while singing the song just gets more and more embarrassing and inappropriate with the passage of time. People can say, oh, well, he's just doing a blues song. Well, what if he were covering a Bollywood cover? Would he do an Indian accent? This, to me, is cringy, and I'm kind of glad it's the last song because I can just lift the needle. So this is a monster of an album, and in its day, it was the heaviest rock record ever made. 6 of the 9 tracks on here would rank amongst the best songs that Zeppelin ever recorded, and A Whole Lotta Love is a contender possibly for the best thing they ever did. Impressive stuff, and a throwaway drum solo and a dodgy blues cover are really the only limitations. They'd get better, but they'd never really get heavier, and for me, this is 4.5 out of 5 stars.